I still remember the way the autumn sunlight filtered through my bedroom window that Tuesday morning in October, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floor of our small apartment in Albany, New York. The leaves outside were turning that perfect shade of amber that only exists in upstate New York, and I could hear the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Mrs. Henderson's coffee grinder next door, the distant hum of traffic on Central Avenue, and the gentle snoring of my best friend. Max was sprawled across the foot of my bed, his golden retriever coat catching the morning light like honey. At 8 years old, he was beginning to show his age, a few gray hairs around his muzzle, a slight stiffness in his back legs when he first got up. But to me, he was still the same puppy Mom had brought home when I was 6. I was 14 now, and Max had been my constant companion through everything. My parents' divorce when I was 10, the move to this smaller apartment, the lonely afternoons when Mom worked double shifts at the diner. "Morning, buddy," I whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears the way he loved. His tail began its familiar thump, thump, thump against the mattress, and those warm brown eyes opened to look at me with the kind of unconditional love that only dogs can give. Max stretched, his paws reaching toward me as he let out a satisfied groan. This was our routine, every morning for the past 8 years. He'd wait patiently for me to wake up, never rushing, never demanding, just present. Then we'd head to the kitchen where I'd fill his blue ceramic bowl with kibble while Mom made coffee, if she wasn't already at work. But this morning felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite identify, a tension that seemed to cling to the walls of our small 2-bedroom apartment. Mom had been on the phone late last night. I could hear her hushed, worried voice through the thin walls, though I couldn't make out the words. When I'd asked her about it at breakfast yesterday, she'd just smiled, that tired smile she'd been wearing more often lately, and said, "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetie." I slipped out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor, and Max immediately jumped down beside me. His movement was slower than usual, and I noticed him favor his right front paw slightly. I made a mental note to mention it to Mom. Maybe we should take him to Dr. Martinez for a checkup. The apartment was quiet as we made our way to the kitchen. Mom's bedroom door was closed, which was unusual for a Tuesday morning. She was usually up before dawn, getting ready for the breakfast shift at Murphy's Diner on Delaware Avenue. I could hear voices through her door. She was on the phone again, speaking in that same hushed, worried tone from the night before. I filled Max's bowl and watched him eat, the way he delicately picked up each piece of kibble, chewed it thoughtfully, then looked up at me as if to say thank you before taking the next bite. Everything about Max was gentle, patient, grateful. He approached life with a dignity that I envied, even as a 14-year-old who thought he knew everything. The autumn morning outside our kitchen window was beautiful, the kind of day that made you want to walk through Washington Park and kick through the fallen leaves, maybe throw a tennis ball for Max in the dog run near the pond. The maple tree in our small courtyard was dropping its leaves in lazy spirals, and I could see other dog owners in the distance, walking their companions along the sidewalk. That's when I heard Mom's door open, followed by her footsteps in the hallway. But instead of her usual cheerful "morning, honey," there was silence. When she appeared in the kitchen doorway, I knew something was terribly wrong. Mom's face was pale and her eyes were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. She was still in her pajamas, a faded blue set that she'd had since I was little, and her dark hair was messy like she'd been running her hands through it. She looked at me, then at Max, who had finished his breakfast and was sitting patiently by my side, sensing the change in atmosphere the way dogs always do. "Honey, we need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My stomach dropped. Those 4 words, "we need to talk," had preceded every major change in my life. My parents' divorce, the move to this apartment, and now something else was coming, something that would change everything again. Mom sat down at our small kitchen table, the one we'd bought at a yard sale 3 years ago because it was all we could afford after the divorce. She patted the chair next to her and I sat down slowly, Max immediately positioning himself between my legs, his warm body pressed against my shins. He knew something was wrong too. "The hospital called last night," Mom began, her voice shaking slightly. "Your grandmother, she's gotten worse. Much worse. The doctors say it's time. They say I need to be there in Phoenix to help make decisions about her care. My grandmother had been sick for months with something the doctors called progressive lung disease. Mom had been sending money when she could, calling every few days, but Grandma lived in Arizona with my Aunt Sarah, and we couldn't afford to visit. The last time I'd seen Grandma was at Christmas 2 years ago. when she'd driven all the way from Phoenix to spend the holidays with us in our old house, back when Dad still lived with us. How long? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from the look in Mom's eyes. I don't know, sweetheart. The doctors say. They say it could be weeks, maybe a month. I have to be there. She raised me after my dad died, and I can't let her go through this alone. I felt Max shift against my legs, his head coming up to rest on my knee. His eyes were fixed on my face, reading my emotions the way he always did, offering comfort without being asked. What about school? What about... I gestured vaguely around our small apartment, at the life we'd built here after everything fell apart. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cold and I could feel them trembling slightly. You'll come with me, of course. We'll figure out the school situation later. Maybe you can finish the semester online or transfer to a school in Phoenix temporarily. But honey, she paused, and I saw her glance at Max, who was still pressed against my legs, his presence steady and warm. The apartment where Aunt Sarah lives, where we'll be staying, they don't allow pets. No exceptions. The words hung in the air between us like a physical weight. I felt the world tilt sideways, the familiar safety of our morning routine suddenly feeling fragile and temporary. Max's tail gave a small wag, as if he was trying to reassure me that everything would be okay, even though he couldn't possibly understand what we were discussing. But he's family, I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. Max's family. I know, baby, I know he is. But we don't have a choice. I've already called around. Boarding kennels are expensive, more than we can afford for that long. And asking friends to take him for weeks or maybe months, it's not fair to anyone. The morning light streaming through our kitchen window suddenly felt different, harsher, less golden. I could hear the sounds of our neighborhood continuing outside. Life going on as normal while ours was being dismantled piece by piece. Mrs. Henderson's radio was playing softly next door, some old jazz song that drifted through the thin walls. Max seemed to sense the change in energy. He stood up and walked over to Mom, resting his head on her knee the same way he'd done with me. Even in the middle of what was clearly a family crisis, he was trying to comfort us both. That's what Max did. He gave without asking for anything in return, except to be loved. Mom reached down and stroked his head, her eyes filling with tears again. There's one option, she said quietly, not looking at me. Dr. Martinez mentioned that Albany Memorial Hospital has a therapy dog program. They're always looking for gentle, well-trained dogs to work with patients, especially children. Max would be perfect for it. He'd have a home, a purpose, people who would care for him. But he wouldn't be with us, I interrupted, my voice cracking. No, Mom said, finally meeting my eyes. He wouldn't be with us. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall above our refrigerator. Max had moved to sit equidistant between Mom and me, his head turning back and forth as if he was following our conversation. Outside, I could hear the school bus rumbling down Central Avenue, carrying kids to classes that suddenly seemed unimportant. I thought about all the mornings like this one, all the afternoons when I'd come home from school to find Max waiting by the door, tail wagging, ready to hear about my day. I thought about the nights when thunderstorms scared me and I'd hide under the covers while Max pressed his solid, warm body against mine, letting me know I wasn't alone. I thought about the day we'd brought him home as a puppy, how he'd cried his first night away from his littermates until I'd snuck him into my bed, where he'd slept every night since. When? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Our flight is Thursday morning, Mom said. Early. We'd need to take Max to the hospital tomorrow afternoon. Give him time to get settled with the program coordinator before we leave. Thursday. That was 2 days away. 48 hours to say goodbye to 8 years of unconditional love, morning routines, shared secrets, and silent companionship. Max stretched and walked back over to me, resting his chin on my lap. His brown eyes looked up at me with complete trust, complete faith that whatever happened, I would take care of him. That's what made this so much harder. He trusted me completely, and I was about to let him down in the biggest way possible. But as I sat there in our small kitchen, with the autumn morning light shifting across the table and the sounds of our neighborhood continuing outside, I realized something that would stay with me forever. Sometimes loving someone means making the hardest choice of all, even when it breaks your heart. The decision was made, but the hardest part was yet to come, convincing Max and myself that this was the right thing to do. The rest of Tuesday passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. I went to school, sat through algebra and English literature, ate lunch in the cafeteria, but none of it felt real. It was as if I was watching someone else's life unfold while my mind stayed fixed on the image of Max sitting in our kitchen, trusting and patient, unaware that his world was about to change forever. When I got home that afternoon, Max was waiting by the door as always, his tail creating a rhythmic thump against the wall as soon as he heard my key in the lock. The sight of him there, so normal and reliable, made my chest tighten with a pain I'd never experienced before. "Hey, buddy," I said, dropping my backpack and kneeling down to his level. He immediately came to me, pressing his head against my chest, his tail wagging with genuine joy at my return. This was our routine. Every day for 8 years, he'd greet me like I'd been gone for weeks instead of hours. I buried my face in his golden fur, breathing in his familiar scent, a mixture of dog shampoo, the outdoors, and something indefinably warm that was just Max. He stood patiently as I held him, occasionally licking my ear or giving a small whimper of contentment. Mom was in her bedroom packing. I could hear dresser drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping across the closet rod, the sound of her suitcase zipper, the sounds of departure, of leaving, of everything changing. "Want to go for a walk?" I asked Max, and his ears perked up immediately. The word walk was magic to him, no matter what else was happening in the world. We headed out into the Albany afternoon, the October air crisp and clean with that specific smell of autumn in upstate New York, fallen leaves, wood smoke from distant fireplaces, the faint scent of apples from the orchard on the outskirts of town. Our neighborhood was quiet at this time of day. Most kids were inside doing homework, most adults still at work. Max trotted beside me with his characteristic easy gait, stopping occasionally to investigate a particularly interesting smell or to mark his territory on a familiar fire hydrant. He had a whole map of the neighborhood in his mind, I was sure. Every tree we'd walked past, every house where another dog lived, every spot where he'd found something exciting to sniff. We walked our usual route through the residential streets toward Washington Park. Max knew the way by heart and would often lead, looking back occasionally to make sure I was following. The park was one of his favorite places, wide open spaces to run, other dogs to meet, squirrels to chase, though he'd never actually caught one, and I suspected he didn't really want to. As we walked, I found myself paying attention to details I'd normally overlook. The way Max held his head high, alert and interested in everything around him. The way his tail curved over his back when he was happy, like it was now. The way he automatically moved to the inside of the sidewalk when we passed other pedestrians, a habit I'd trained into him when he was a puppy for safety. At the park, I unclipped his leash in the designated off-leash area, and Max immediately bounded toward the pond where a few ducks were floating lazily in the afternoon sun. He'd never shown any interest in actually going after the ducks. He just liked to watch them, his head tilted in that curious way dogs have when they're trying to understand something. I sat on our favorite bench, the one under the old oak tree that provided shade in summer and a perfect view of the pond. Max explored for a few minutes, then came back to sit beside the bench, not quite ready to settle down but wanting to stay close. Other dog owners were scattered around the park with their companions. There was Mrs. Rodriguez with her elderly beagle, Sam, who moved slowly but with great dignity. A young couple I didn't recognize had an energetic border collie mix that was racing in circles, trying to engage Max in play. Max watched with polite interest but didn't join in. At 8 years old, he was past the age of frantic running, more content to observe and enjoy the afternoon. I watched all these dogs with their people and wondered about their stories. Had any of them ever faced what we were facing? Had they ever had to make the choice between keeping their companion and doing what was right for their family? The sun was beginning to set earlier now that we were well into October, and the air was getting chilly. Max seemed to sense that our park time was ending and came to sit directly in front of me. His brown eyes focused on my face with that intense attention that always made me feel like the most important person in the world. "You're a good boy, Max," I said, scratching behind his ears. "You've always been such a good boy." His tail wagged, and he leaned into my touch. In that moment, I made a decision. If these were going to be our last days together, I wanted them to be perfect. I wanted to give Max every good thing I could think of, to make memories that would have to last both of us for whatever came next. On the walk home, I stopped at Peterson's Corner Market, the small grocery store where Mr. Peterson knew every customer by name and always kept dog treats behind the counter for the neighborhood pets. Max waited patiently outside while I bought the good treats, the expensive ones Mom usually said we couldn't afford. and a small beef bone that would take him hours to enjoy. Special occasion? Mr. Peterson asked as he rang up my purchases. Something like that, I replied, not trusting myself to explain. When we got home, Mom was in the living room with her laptop, making arrangements for our trip. Her face was drawn and tired, and I could see the stress in the set of her shoulders, the way she kept running her hand through her hair. "How was school?" she asked, looking up from her screen. "Fine," I said, which was what I always said, even though today had been anything but fine. "I got Max some treats." She smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "That's nice, honey. He deserves some good treats." I gave Max the bone, and he carried it carefully to his bed in the corner of the living room, a faded blue cushion that we'd bought at a pet store going out of business sale years ago. He settled down with great ceremony, holding the bone between his paws and beginning to work on it with the focused concentration he brought to all his favorite activities. That evening, instead of doing homework or watching TV, I sat on the floor next to Max's bed and just watched him. He would work on his bone for a few minutes, then rest his head on his paws and look at me, then go back to his bone. Occasionally, his tail would give a small wag, as if he was saying thank you or I'm happy you're here. Mom joined us after a while, sitting on the couch with her own cup of tea, and we all stayed there in comfortable quiet. The only sounds were the gentle scraping of Max's teeth on his bone, the tick of our kitchen clock, and the distant hum of traffic on Central Avenue. Around 9 o'clock, Mom spoke up quietly. "I called Dr. Martinez today," she said. "He's going to meet us at the hospital tomorrow at 3 o'clock. He knows the program coordinator there, a woman named Sarah Chen. She's worked with therapy dogs for years, and she sounds really wonderful." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He also said, Mom's voice caught slightly. He said that Max is exactly the kind of dog they're looking for. Gentle, well-trained, good with people. He'll be helping patients, especially children who are scared or lonely. He'll have a purpose there, a way to help people. I looked down at Max, who had finished with his bone and was now lying on his side, his head resting on his paws. His eyes were alert, watching both Mom and me, sensing the emotional undercurrents in the room even if he didn't understand the words. "Will we be able to visit him?" I asked. Mom was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think so, honey. Not for a while. We don't know how long we'll be in Phoenix and when we come back. It might be better for Max if he doesn't get confused about where his home is." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only were we giving up Max, but we were giving him up completely. No visits, no updates, no way to know if he was happy or sad or missing us. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling while Max snored softly at my feet, and I thought about all the nights like this one. Thousands of them, stretching back 8 years to when Max was small enough to curl up in the crook of my arm. I thought about the comfort of his presence during thunderstorms, the way he'd seemed to understand when I was sad about my parents' divorce, how he'd stayed close during those first difficult weeks in this apartment. Around midnight, I made another decision. I carefully moved to the edge of the bed and patted the mattress beside me. "Come here, buddy," I whispered. Max lifted his head and I could see his eyes gleaming in the darkness. He stood up, stretched, and then jumped up onto the bed beside me, something he'd been doing for 8 years but which I suddenly realized he might never do again. He settled in next to me, his warm body pressed against my side, his head on the pillow next to mine. I could feel his steady breathing, the solid reality of his presence, and I tried to memorize everything about this moment. The weight of him beside me, the sound of his breathing, the way his fur felt under my hand. "I love you, Max," I whispered into the darkness. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that. You're the best friend I've ever had." He gave a small sigh and shifted closer, as if he understood. And maybe he did. Dogs have their own way of knowing things, their own emotional intelligence that often surpasses our own. I fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning, with Max's head resting on my shoulder and my hand buried in his fur. It was the last night we would ever spend together like that, though I tried not to think about that as sleep finally claimed me. Tomorrow would bring the hardest day of my 14 years. But tonight, we were still together, still a family of 2 who understood each other perfectly. I woke up Wednesday morning to the sound of rain tapping against my bedroom window. A gentle, steady autumn rain that turned the world outside gray and soft. Max was still beside me on the bed, but he was awake, his head lifted and ears alert. He'd heard something that my human ears had missed. Probably Mom moving around in the kitchen, getting ready for what would be one of the most difficult days of our lives. The digital clock on my nightstand read 6:47 a.m. Usually I had to drag myself out of bed for school, but today sleep felt impossible anyway. Every moment I spent unconscious was a moment I wasn't spending with Max, and time had suddenly become the most precious commodity in the world. "Morning, buddy," I said softly, and Max's tail began its familiar morning rhythm against the mattress. He turned to look at me, and I swear there was something different in his eyes. Not sadness exactly, because dogs don't think about the future the way humans do, but a kind of extra attention, as if he was trying to memorize this moment too. I could smell coffee brewing in the kitchen and hear Mom's quiet movements. She was trying not to wake me, not knowing that I'd barely slept anyway. The rain outside had intensified, turning from gentle tapping to steady drumming, and I could see droplets racing each other down the glass of my window. Max stretched, his paws reaching toward me, then stood up and shook himself all over, his typical morning routine. But instead of jumping down from the bed right away, he stayed there for a moment longer, pressing his nose against my cheek in what felt like an extra-long morning greeting. I sat up and wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his fur the way I had when I was younger, and the world felt scary. He still had that same comforting smell, that warm, clean scent that meant safety and love and home. I wanted to stay like that forever, holding on to him in this moment and the life we'd built together. But eventually, I had to let go. Max jumped down from the bed and padded toward the bedroom door, looking back at me with that patient expression that said he was ready for breakfast, but would wait for me to be ready too. Everything about Max was considerate, even his basic needs. I followed him to the kitchen where Mom was standing by the counter with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the rain. She was already dressed in her good jeans and a sweater, not her usual work clothes for the diner. Today was different, a day for difficult conversations and impossible decisions. "How did you sleep?" she asked when she heard me come in. "Not great," I admitted, filling Max's bowl with kibble. He waited patiently beside me, not pushing or demanding, just standing ready. Even his eating was polite. "Me neither," Mom said quietly. "I kept thinking about when we first got Max. Do you remember? You were so small and he was just a puppy. He cried his first night and you insisted on sleeping on the floor next to his crate to keep him company." I did remember, though I'd been only 6 years old. Max had been tiny then, all golden fluff and oversized paws, scared and missing his litter mates. I'd begged Mom and Dad to let me sleep downstairs with him, and finally Dad had helped me drag my mattress to the living room so Max wouldn't be alone. "He never liked being alone," I said, watching Max eat his breakfast with his usual careful precision. "No," Mom agreed. "He never did. That's why I think this therapy dog program might be perfect for him. He'll always be around people, always have someone to help and comfort. It's what he was born to do." I knew she was trying to make us both feel better about what we had to do, trying to find meaning in the heartbreak. And maybe she was right. Max had always been drawn to people who were sad or hurt or lonely. During my parents' divorce, he'd somehow known to spend extra time with me, to be extra gentle and patient. When Mom came home from particularly hard days at the diner, Max would go to her immediately, resting his head on her lap until she felt better. After breakfast, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to school. Mom looked at me questioningly when she heard me on the phone with the attendance office, but she didn't say anything. She understood that I needed this day, these last few hours with Max before everything changed. "What do you want to do today?" Mom asked after I hung up. "I want to give Max the best day ever," I said. "I want to do all his favorite things." And so we did. Despite the rain, we went for a long walk through the neighborhood with Max wearing the little yellow raincoat Mom had bought him years ago. He looked dignified in it, accepting the necessity of rain protection, but making it clear that he was doing this for our sake, not his own. We walked past all his favorite spots. The fire hydrant on Elm Street that he always marked. The house where the friendly golden retriever named Bella lived behind a fence. The corner where the hot dog vendor sometimes dropped pieces of meat that Max was allowed to clean up. Today, everything seemed significant. Every mundane detail worth remembering. At Washington Park, even though it was raining, we found a covered pavilion where Max could be off-leash for a while. He didn't run around much. The wet weather made him more contemplative, but he explored with his usual thoroughness, sniffing every corner and post, cataloging all the messages left by other dogs. I sat on a picnic table under the pavilion and watched him, trying to imprint every detail into my memory. The way his ears perked up when he heard an interesting sound, the graceful way he moved despite his age, the frequent glances he sent my way to make sure I was still there and still paying attention. Around noon, we went to Murphy's Diner where Mom worked. She'd called ahead, and her boss, Mr. Murphy, said it was fine for Max to come in during the slow afternoon hours. Max had been to the diner before. He was well known among the regular customers and staff, all of whom made a fuss over him whenever he visited. "There's my favorite customer," called out Jenny, one of the other waitresses, when we walked in. Max's tail began wagging immediately at the familiar voices and smells. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon and home-cooked food, comforting scents that Max associated with good things. Mr. Murphy, a stocky man in his 60s, who'd owned the diner for 30 years, came out from behind the counter with a small piece of grilled chicken for Max. "Can't have you leaving town without saying goodbye to old Murphy," he said, kneeling down to Max's level. Max accepted the treat graciously, his tail wagging, and allowed Mr. Murphy to scratch behind his ears. I wondered if Max could sense that this was goodbye, or if he just thought it was another regular visit to see Mom's work friends. We spent an hour at the diner, with Max making his rounds to greet everyone, receiving pets and treats and kind words. Mom's co-workers all knew about our situation. Small-town diners are places where everyone knows everyone else's business, and they were extra gentle with both Max and me. "He's going to do great things at that hospital," Jenny said, kneeling down to give Max one last pet. "Dogs like this one, they're special. They know how to help people feel better." By the time we left the diner, it was after 2 o'clock. The rain had stopped, and weak autumn sunlight was trying to break through the clouds. We had less than an hour before we needed to be at Albany Memorial Hospital. The drive there was quiet. Max sat in the back seat of our old Honda, looking out the window with mild interest at the passing scenery. He'd always been a good car passenger, never anxious or restless, just alert and ready for whatever adventure awaited at our destination. Albany Memorial Hospital was a large modern building on the north side of town, surrounded by parking lots and landscaped areas. I'd passed it hundreds of times in my life but had never paid much attention to it. Today it loomed large and significant, the place where everything would change. Dr. Martinez was waiting for us in the main lobby, along with a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and kind eyes. She was wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon dogs and cats, and she had the patient, gentle demeanor that I'd come to associate with people who worked with animals. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending her hand to me. "I'm Sarah Chen, the therapy animal coordinator here at Albany Memorial, and this must be Max." Max, ever the gentleman, walked forward and offered his paw to Sarah, a trick I'd taught him when he was young. She laughed with delight and shook his paw formally. "Oh, he's perfect," she said, kneeling down to Max's level. "Dr. Martinez told me about him, but seeing him in person, he has exactly the right temperament for this work." Max seemed to like Sarah immediately, which was both a relief and another small heartbreak. He leaned into her touch as she petted him, his tail wagging with genuine pleasure. It hurt to see how easily he connected with people, how ready he was to love and trust even as I was preparing to leave him. "Would you like to see where Max will be living?" Sarah asked gently. "I think it might help you both to understand what his days will be like here." As we followed Sarah deeper into the hospital, I felt like I was walking toward the edge of a cliff, each step taking me closer to the moment when everything would change forever. The therapy animal area of Albany Memorial Hospital was nothing like I had imagined. Instead of sterile, cold hospital corridors, Sarah led us through a side entrance into what looked more like a comfortable home. The floors were warm hardwood instead of institutional linoleum, and the walls were painted in soft, welcoming colors. Framed photographs of dogs and cats with their patient partners lined the hallways, and I could hear the gentle sound of classical music playing from speakers hidden somewhere in the ceiling. This wing was specifically designed for our animal therapy program, Sarah explained as we walked. We wanted it to feel as unhospital-like as possible, both for the animals and for the patients they work with. Max trotted beside us with his usual calm interest, taking in the new smells and sounds without anxiety. I could see his nose working as he processed all the information. Other dogs, cleaning supplies, the underlying sense of medicine and humanity that permeated any hospital, but also something else, something warmer and more welcoming. "How many dogs live here?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "Right now we have 6 full-time therapy dogs," Sarah replied. And about a dozen cats plus some visiting animals that come in with their handlers during the week. Max would be our seventh dog, and honestly, we've been hoping to find someone exactly like him for months. We passed several rooms with large windows looking out onto a small courtyard garden. Through one of the windows I could see an elderly golden retriever lying contentedly on a dog bed, while a young girl in a hospital gown sat beside him, reading aloud from a picture book. The dog's tail gave a lazy wag every time the girl turned a page, and she would pause occasionally to pet his head or whisper something in his ear. "That's Benjamin," Sarah said, following my gaze. "He's been with us for 3 years now. The little girl is Emma. She's been in and out of the hospital for treatments, and Benjamin has become her special friend. Sometimes she asks to read to him instead of having the nurses read to her." I felt Mom's hand on my shoulder, a gentle pressure that was meant to be comforting but only reminded me of what we were about to do. Max had moved closer to the window, apparently intrigued by the sight of another dog his own age. "The dogs live here?" I asked. "Like, all the time?" "They do," Sarah confirmed. "We have a full-time veterinary staff, specialized nutrition, exercise schedules, grooming services, everything they need to stay healthy and happy. But more than that, they have jobs that give them purpose. Every morning, each dog has a schedule of patients to visit. Some work with children in the pediatric ward, others with elderly patients in long-term care, some with people recovering from surgery or dealing with chronic illnesses." She opened a door marked residential area and led us into what was essentially a very upscale boarding facility. Instead of traditional kennels, there were individual rooms with glass fronts, each one furnished like a small bedroom. The floors were heated, and each room had a comfortable bed, toys, water dishes, and windows looking out onto the courtyard. "This would be Max's room," Sarah said, opening the door to a corner unit that was slightly larger than the others. "The corner rooms are for our senior dogs. They get extra space and quieter surroundings." The room was beautiful, I had to admit. The walls were painted a warm sage green, and there was a large plush dog bed positioned to catch the afternoon sunlight from the window. Shelves held various toys and enrichment items, and I could see a door that led to a private outdoor run. Max walked into the room without hesitation, sniffing around with professional interest. He investigated the bed, the water bowl, the selection of toys, and then came back to sit beside me, looking up expectantly as if to say, "This is nice, but when are we going home?" "We try to match each dog with work that suits their personality," Sarah continued. "From what Dr. Martinez has told me about Max, I think he'd be perfect for our pediatric program. Children respond to him immediately, and he has that calm, patient demeanor that works so well with kids who are scared or in pain." I watched Max explore his potential new room and felt something breaking apart inside my chest. This place was wonderful, better than I'd dared to hope, but it wasn't home. It wasn't our small apartment where Max had claimed his spot on my bed, where he knew every squeak in the floorboards and every sound that meant I was coming home from school. "Can I have a few minutes alone with him?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. Sarah and Dr. Martinez exchanged a look, and I saw understanding pass between them. They'd probably seen this scene play out dozens of times. Families making impossible choices, children saying goodbye to beloved pets, the necessary heartbreak that came with doing what was right instead of what was wanted. "Of course," Sarah said gently. "Take all the time you need. We'll be right outside." Mom leaned down and kissed the top of my head. "I'll be right here when you're ready, sweetheart," she whispered, and then she followed Sarah and Dr. Martinez out of the room, leaving Max and me alone. The silence that followed was different from any quiet we'd ever shared. Usually, silence between Max and me was comfortable, companionable, full of understanding. This silence felt heavy with all the things I couldn't say, all the explanations I couldn't give him about why his life was about to change completely. I sat down on the floor next to the dog bed, and Max immediately came to me, settling himself between my legs the way he'd done thousands of times before. His weight was solid and warm and familiar, and I wrapped my arms around him, pressing my face into his fur. "I'm so sorry, Max," I whispered, and my voice cracked on the words. "I'm so sorry we have to do this. If there was any other way, any way at all, I would take it. But Grandma is dying, and Mom needs to be with her, and I can't ask you to live in some boarding kennel for months while we figure out our lives." Max's tail gave a small wag, and he turned his head to lick my cheek, his universal gesture of comfort, his way of saying that whatever was wrong, he would help fix it if he could. "You're going to help people here," I continued, the words coming out in a rush. Kids who are scared and alone, just like I was scared and alone when Mom and Dad got divorced. You're going to be their friend the way you've been mine. You're going to make them feel better just by being yourself, patient and gentle and good. I pulled back to look at his face. Those brown eyes that had watched me grow from a 6-year-old who needed protection to a 14-year-old who was trying so hard to be mature about an impossible situation. His ears were at attention, focused completely on me, and his expression was alert and loving. "But I need you to know something," I said, my voice steadying even as tears started flowing down my cheeks. "I need you to know that leaving you here doesn't mean we don't love you. It means we love you so much that we want you to have a life with purpose, with people around you all the time, with important work to do. You were never just a pet to us, Max. You were family. You are family." Max shifted slightly, moving closer, and rested his chin on my shoulder. It was a gesture I'd seen him make hundreds of times when I was upset about school or friends or the general unfairness of growing up. He was comforting me even now, in the middle of his own life being turned upside down. "I won't forget you," I promised, my words muffled against his fur. "I won't ever forget you. And someday, when all of this is over and we have a home again, a real home where pets are allowed, if you want to, if you're not too happy here, maybe we could be together again." Even as I said it, I knew it was probably a false promise. By the time our lives stabilized, Max would be settled here, bonded with his patients, part of a routine that didn't include me. But I needed to say it anyway, needed to believe that this goodbye might not be forever. The door opened quietly and I heard Sarah's gentle voice. "Marcus? I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should probably get Max settled before the evening shift change. It'll be easier for him to adjust if we can introduce him to his primary handler while it's still quiet." I nodded without looking up, not trusting myself to speak. Max must have sensed the finality in Sarah's words because he stood up and walked a few steps toward the door, then looked back at me with a questioning expression. This was it. This was the moment I'd been dreading since yesterday morning when Mom first told me what we had to do. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and Max came back to stand beside me. He was being perfectly behaved, perfectly trusting, ready to follow my lead wherever I took him. That trust was what made this so much harder. He believed that whatever I decided would be in his best interest, because that's what love meant to him. "Stay," I said quietly, gesturing to the dog bed. It was a command Max knew well, one I'd taught him years ago for his own safety. He looked at me questioningly but walked over to the bed and lay down, his eyes still fixed on my face. I walked to the door, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. At the threshold, I turned back to look at him one more time. He was lying on the bed with his head up, alert and waiting, trusting that I would either come back for him or that this was where he was supposed to be. "Don't let him be alone," I whispered, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Please. He's never liked being alone." Sarah nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "He won't be alone, Marcus. I promise you that. There's always someone here, always other animals, always patients who need him. He'll never be alone." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But as I stepped out of that room and heard the door close softly behind me, cutting me off from 8 years of unconditional love and morning routines and silent companionship, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Mom was waiting in the hallway and she immediately pulled me into her arms. I let myself be 14 years old for a moment, let myself cry against her shoulder while the sound of my sobs echoed off the cheerful, welcoming walls of the therapy animal wing. Through my tears, I could hear Sarah talking quietly with Dr. Martinez about Max's feeding schedule, his favorite toys, his quirks and preferences. She was being thorough, professional, caring, exactly the kind of person I would want taking care of my best friend. But knowing that didn't make walking away any easier. As we left the hospital that evening, I couldn't bring myself to look back at the building where Max was beginning his new life, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and run back to him. The flight to Phoenix was early Thursday morning, just as Mom had said. I'd barely slept Wednesday night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Max's face as I'd walked away from him. That patient, trusting expression that said he was waiting for me to come back and explain what was happening. Our apartment felt wrong without him. There was no gentle snoring from the foot of my bed, no click of nails on hardwood when someone moved around in the kitchen, no jingle of collar tags when he shifted positions. The silence was profound and unsettling, like a song missing its most important notes. Mom tried to be gentle with me as we got ready to leave, speaking in soft tones and moving quietly around the apartment as we did our final packing. But I could see the grief in her eyes, too. Max had been her companion through the divorce, through long shifts at the diner, through all the uncertainty of building a new life as a single mother. "I keep expecting to see him," she said quietly as we stood in the living room with our suitcases, taking one last look around. "Every time I turn a corner, I expect him to be there." His blue food bowl was still on the kitchen floor, and his faded bed was still in the corner of the living room. Mom had asked if I wanted to take them for when we got settled somewhere permanent, but I couldn't bear the thought of packing up the physical remnants of his life in our home. "Maybe Mrs. Henderson would like them for her granddog when he visits," I suggested, and Mom nodded, understanding that I needed these familiar objects to stay here, to remain part of the life Max had lived with us. The taxi ride to Albany International Airport was quiet except for the driver's radio playing softly in the background. Some talk show discussing local politics and school budget issues. Normal life, continuing on while ours had been completely rearranged. I'd never been on a plane before. Under other circumstances, the experience might have been exciting. The bustle of the airport, the massive planes visible through the terminal windows, the sense of adventure that came with traveling to a place I'd never been. But all I could think about was Max waking up in his new room at the hospital, possibly wondering where I was, why I hadn't come to take him for his morning walk. "Sarah said she'd email us updates," Mom said as we waited at our gate. "Let us know how Max is settling in, maybe send some photos of him with his new job." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if updates would make me feel better or worse. Part of me wanted to know everything, how he was eating, whether he was making friends with the other dogs, if the children in the hospital liked him. But another part of me was afraid that hearing about his new life would make it real, would confirm that he was moving on without me. The flight to Phoenix was 5 hours with one connection in Chicago. I spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape change from the autumn colors of upstate New York to the vast flatness of the Midwest, to the desert browns and reds of Arizona. Mom dozed fitfully beside me, exhausted from the stress of the past few days and the worry about her mother. Aunt Sarah met us at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. I hadn't seen her since Christmas 2 years ago, but she looked older now, thinner, with stress lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She hugged us both fiercely, and I could feel her shaking slightly. "Mom's been asking about you both," she said as we collected our luggage. She's not doing well, but she's been holding on, waiting for you to get here." The drive to Aunt Sarah's apartment complex took us through parts of Phoenix I'd never seen. Wide boulevards lined with palm trees, strip malls and chain restaurants, housing developments that stretched toward the desert mountains in the distance. Everything looked new and temporary, so different from the old neighborhoods and established trees of Albany. Aunt Sarah's apartment was in a complex called Desert Springs, a collection of beige stucco buildings arranged around a central courtyard with a swimming pool and some struggling palm trees. The "No Pets" sign was prominently displayed at the entrance, and I felt a fresh stab of pain seeing it. "I'm sorry about Max," Aunt Sarah said quietly as we carried our bags toward her second-floor unit. "I know how much he meant to you both. If there was any way—" "It's okay," I said automatically, though it wasn't okay and might never be okay. "The hospital program sounds really good. He'll be helping people." Aunt Sarah's apartment was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms and a living room that looked out over the courtyard. She'd made up the couch for me and cleared space in her closet for our things. Everything was beige and neutral, temporary feeling, like a place you stayed while you figured out where you really wanted to be. "Mom's at St. Joseph's Hospital," Aunt Sarah explained as we settled in. "About 20 minutes from here. The visiting hours are pretty flexible given the circumstances. Do you want to rest first or would you like to go see her?" I looked at Mom, who was sitting on the edge of the couch looking drained and overwhelmed. The past few days had taken everything out of her, and I realized that while I'd been focused on losing Max, she'd been dealing with the impending loss of her own mother. "Let's go see Grandma," I said. We didn't come all this way to wait. St. Joseph's Hospital was larger and more modern than Albany Memorial, but it had the same underlying smell of disinfectant and human worry that seemed to permeate all medical facilities. Grandma was in the ICU, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and displayed numbers that meant things I didn't understand. She looked tiny in the hospital bed, smaller than I remembered. Her hair, which had always been carefully styled, was wispy and gray against the white pillow, and her breathing was labored even with the oxygen mask covering her nose and mouth. But when she saw us come in, her eyes brightened with recognition and what might have been relief. "Mary," she whispered to Mom, her voice muffled by the mask. "You came." "Of course I came, Mom," Mom said, taking Grandma's hand. "Of course." Grandma's eyes found me standing at the foot of the bed. "Marcus, you got so tall and handsome, just like your father when he was young." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just smiled and moved closer to the bed. Grandma's hand, when she reached for mine, felt paper-thin and fragile, but her grip was still firm. "Tell me about school," she said. "Tell me about your friends. Tell me about that dog of yours, Max, isn't it?" The mention of Max hit me like a physical blow, and I felt tears spring to my eyes before I could stop them. Mom must have seen my expression because she squeezed Grandma's hand gently. "We had to make arrangements for Max, Mom. We didn't know how long we'd be here, and Sarah's apartment doesn't allow pets." Grandma looked from Mom to me, and I saw understanding dawn in her tired eyes. She'd raised 4 children and countless grandchildren. She knew about the hard choices that life sometimes forced you to make. "Oh, honey," she said to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. That must have been so hard." And somehow, hearing those words from Grandma, who was facing her own ending with dignity and grace, broke something loose inside me. The tears I'd been holding back since yesterday afternoon came flooding out, along with words I hadn't planned to say. "I left him at a hospital in Albany," I said through my tears. "They have a therapy dog program and he's going to help sick kids, but I don't know if he understands why I left him there. I don't know if he thinks I abandoned him." Grandma was quiet for a moment. Her breathing labored, but her eyes focused intently on my face. "Animals understand love," she said finally. "They might not understand all the human complications, jobs and money and family obligations, but they understand love. And if you loved that dog the way I think you did, he knows it. He'll carry that love with him wherever he goes, whatever he does." She paused, gathering strength for her next words. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let go, even when it breaks our hearts, even when it's the last thing in the world we want to do." I stayed at Grandma's bedside until late that evening, listening to her stories about Mom as a child, about the family farm in Iowa where she'd grown up, about the pet dogs she'd had over the years, and how each one had taught her something different about love and loss and moving forward. When we finally got back to Aunt Sarah's apartment, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. But as I lay on the unfamiliar couch in the unfamiliar room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a Phoenix night, all I could think about was Max. Was he sleeping in his new bed at the hospital? Had he figured out his new routine? Was there someone there to comfort him if he had dreams, the way I used to when he whimpered in his sleep? The next morning, Mom's phone chimed with an email notification. She looked at it, and her expression softened. "It's from Sarah Chen," she said quietly. "About Max." My heart started racing. "What does it say?" Mom read silently for a moment, then looked up at me with something that might have been relief. "She says Max had a good first night. He ate his breakfast and went for a walk with one of the handlers, and this afternoon they introduced him to a 7-year-old girl named Lucy, who's been in the hospital for weeks with leukemia." Apparently Lucy hadn't smiled or spoken much to anyone since she'd been admitted, but when she met Max, Mom's voice trailed off and she turned the phone so I could see the photo Sarah had attached. It showed Max lying on a hospital bed next to a small girl with a bald head and tired eyes. But she was smiling, a real, genuine smile, and her small hand was buried in Max's golden fur. Max's expression was alert and gentle, his body language relaxed and content. "He's doing what he was born to do," Mom said softly. "He's helping." I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling something complicated and bittersweet settling in my chest. It hurt to see Max with someone else, to see him giving comfort to another child the way he'd comforted me through so many difficult times. But it also filled me with a strange kind of pride. This was Max being Max, patient, loving, intuitive about what people needed most. Looking at that photo, I began to understand what Grandma had meant about love and letting go, though it would take me much longer to forgive myself for the choice we'd had to make. Chapter 6. Learning to Breathe Again. Grandma died on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after we'd arrived in Phoenix. She passed quietly in her sleep, with Mom holding her hand and Aunt Sarah reading aloud from a book of poetry Grandma had loved since she was young. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I'd gone down to the hospital cafeteria to get coffee for everyone, But when I came back, I could tell immediately from the quality of silence that something had changed. Mom was crying, but it was a different kind of crying than I'd seen from her before. These weren't the desperate, frightened tears she'd shed during the divorce or the worried tears from the night she told me we had to leave Max. These were the tears of someone saying goodbye after having time to say everything that needed to be said. The funeral was small but beautiful, held at a little chapel near the mountains on the outskirts of Phoenix. Grandma had requested cremation, and we scattered her ashes in a desert garden she'd visited often during her years in Arizona. Standing there in the warm November sunlight, surrounded by cacti and wildflowers, I thought about cycles of life and ending and beginning, and how sometimes love meant being present for both. After the funeral, we had decisions to make. Aunt Sarah wanted us to stay in Phoenix, said there were opportunities here, that the cost of living was better than New York, that maybe a fresh start was what we all needed. But I could see in Mom's eyes that she was homesick for Albany, for the familiar rhythms of a place we'd learned to call home after the divorce. "What do you think, Marcus?" Mom asked me one evening as we sat in Aunt Sarah's small living room, sorting through Grandma's possessions and trying to decide what to keep, what to donate, what to carry back with us if we decided to leave. "Do you want to try staying here for a while? Start fresh?" I thought about it seriously. Phoenix wasn't unpleasant. The weather was warm even in November. There were interesting things to see and do, and Aunt Sarah genuinely wanted us to stay. But it didn't feel like home. It felt like a place we were visiting while we figured out where we really belonged. "I want to go back to Albany," I said finally. "I want to finish the school year with my friends. I want to sleep in my own bed again. And I want to be in the same city as Max, even if I can't see him." Mom nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd been feeling the same pull toward home, toward the familiar, toward the life we'd been building before everything got complicated. 3 days later, we were on a plane back to New York, carrying 2 small boxes of Grandma's most precious things: her jewelry, some photographs, a quilt she'd made decades ago that still smelled faintly of her perfume. The flight felt different this time, less like fleeing and more like returning to where we belonged. Our apartment looked exactly the same, but somehow felt different. Mrs. Henderson had been watering our plants and collecting our mail, and she'd left a casserole in the refrigerator with a note that said, "Welcome home. So sorry for your loss." It was good to be back in a place where people knew us, where our grief was acknowledged and supported. That first night back, I lay in my own bed and stared at the spot where Max used to sleep. The emptiness was still there, as profound as it had been the night we left him at the hospital. But somehow, after 3 weeks away, it felt less like a fresh wound and more like a permanent ache, something I was learning to carry. The next morning, there was an email from Sarah Chen waiting in Mom's inbox. I'd been getting updates about Max throughout our time in Phoenix, but seeing his name in the subject line still made my heart race with a mixture of hope and sadness. This update was longer than usual, with several photos attached. Sarah wrote that Max had fully settled into his routine at the hospital and had become something of a star among both staff and patients. He was working primarily with children in the oncology ward, where his calm presence and intuitive understanding of when to stay close and when to give space had made him invaluable. The photos showed Max in various situations, lying on a hospital bed next to a teenage boy who was reading to him, sitting patiently while a little girl in a wheelchair brushed his fur, walking down a hospital corridor with a group of children following behind him, like he was leading a parade. But it was the last photo that took my breath away. Max was in what looked like a hospital playroom, surrounded by at least a dozen children of various ages. Some were in wheelchairs, some had IV poles beside them, some were bald from chemotherapy treatments. But they were all smiling, all focused on Max, who sat in the center of the group with what I could only describe as a satisfied expression. "He looks happy," Mom said quietly, reading over my shoulder. And he did. Max looked purposeful, content, like he'd found exactly where he was supposed to be. It wasn't the same kind of happiness I'd seen in him at home. That was more relaxed, more casual. This was the happiness of important work, of being needed, of using his gifts in service of something bigger than himself. Sarah's email included a note from Lucy, the little girl who'd been Max's first patient assignment. Her leukemia treatment had been successful, and she was going home soon, but she'd wanted to write a letter to Max's previous family to thank us for sharing him. "Dear Max's first family," the letter read in careful 7-year-old handwriting. "Thank you for letting Max come live at the hospital. He made me feel brave when I was scared about the medicine that made me sick. He stayed with me during the bad days and played with me during the good days. I know you miss him, but he is helping lots of kids feel better. He is the best dog in the world. Love, Lucy. I read Lucy's letter 3 times, each reading making something settle more deeply in my chest. This child, who had been scared and alone and facing something no 7-year-old should have to face, had found comfort in Max's presence. He had made her feel brave. He had helped her through the worst time of her young life. This was what Max was meant to do. Not just be loved, but give love. Not just receive comfort, but provide it. The hospital hadn't taken him away from his purpose. It had given him the chance to fulfill it on a scale I never could have provided on my own. That realization didn't make missing him hurt less, but it did make the hurt feel more manageable, more meaningful. Max and I had been separated by circumstances beyond our control, but he was thriving in ways that honored everything good about him. Over the following weeks, as I settled back into my routine at school and Mom returned to her job at the diner, life began to feel normal again. A new normal that included Max's absence, but also included updates about his important work, photos of him with his patients, and the growing understanding that love sometimes meant letting someone become who they were meant to be, even if that meant being apart. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends, working with dogs who were waiting for their forever homes. It wasn't the same as being with Max, but it felt like a way to honor what he'd taught me about patience, gentleness, and the power of simply being present for someone who needed comfort. 3 months after we'd returned from Phoenix, I got my first real surprise since everything had changed. I was walking home from school on a Friday afternoon when I saw a familiar car parked outside our apartment building. Sarah Chen was leaning against it, and standing beside her, tail wagging with what could only be described as joy, was Max. For a moment, I couldn't move. Max looked exactly the same, maybe a little grayer around the muzzle, maybe wearing a new collar with what looked like a hospital ID tag, but unmistakably the same gentle, loving dog who had shared my bed and my secrets for 8 years. Then he saw me, and his entire body went into motion, tail wagging so hard his whole back end was wiggling. A bark of recognition and excitement, a leap forward that was immediately checked by Sarah's gentle hold on his leash. "Surprise," Sarah said, smiling broadly as I approached in a daze. Max had a very special request today. As I knelt down and Max launched himself into my arms with 8 years of accumulated affection and 3 months of stored-up love, I finally understood that some endings aren't really endings at all. They're just new chapters in a story that continues to unfold in ways you never expected. Max's warm weight in my arms felt like coming home and saying goodbye all at once. He pressed his face against my neck, making those small whimpering sounds of joy and recognition that dogs make when they're overwhelmed with emotion. His fur still smelled like Max, that warm, clean scent that meant safety and love, but underneath it was something new, something that smelled like hospital antiseptic and other dogs and the particular scent of important work being done. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at Sarah while Max continued to wiggle against me with barely contained excitement. "Is something wrong? Is he sick?" "Nothing's wrong," Sarah assured me quickly. "Max is healthy and happy and absolutely wonderful at his job. But today is Friday, and Fridays are special for our therapy dogs. If they've been with the program for 3 months and have proven they can handle it emotionally, they get what we call home visits." Mom had come out of the apartment building, attracted by the commotion, and she stopped short when she saw Max. Her hand went to her mouth and I could see tears starting in her eyes. "Once a month," Sarah continued, "our therapy dogs get to spend a weekend with their original families if those families want them to. It helps prevent depression and keeps them connected to the people who loved them first. And Max?" She paused, smiling down at him as he continued to press himself against me as if he was afraid I might disappear again. "Max has been asking about you." "Asking?" I repeated. "Dogs have their ways of communicating," Sarah explained. "For the past 2 weeks, every Friday afternoon, Max has gone to the front entrance of the hospital and sat there, looking out at the parking lot like he's waiting for someone. Yesterday, he brought one of his toys to the entrance and left it there. The behavior was so consistent and specific that Dr. Martinez and I decided it was time to arrange a visit." Mom approached slowly and Max's attention shifted to her, his tail reaching impossible levels of enthusiasm. She knelt down beside us and Max moved to include her in his greeting, as if he was making sure we were all really there, all really together again. "Can he really stay the weekend?" Mom asked. her voice thick with emotion. "If you'd like him to," Sarah said. "I'll pick him up Sunday evening around 6. He needs to be back for his Monday morning shift. He has a new patient, a 9-year-old boy named David who's having surgery next week, and Max has been specifically requested to help with pre-surgery anxiety sessions." The idea of having Max for an entire weekend felt almost too good to be true. But as I looked at him, I could see that this wasn't just about my happiness. Max needed this too. For all his success as a therapy dog, for all the important work he was doing, he was still the same dog who had never liked being alone, who had always been happiest when he was part of a family unit. "What do we need to know?" Mom asked practically. "About his routine, his medications, He's not on any medications," Sarah said. "And his routine is pretty flexible. He gets fed twice a day. Same brand of food he's always eaten. He still likes his walks, though he's not quite as energetic as he used to be. And he's learned some new commands for his therapy work that you might find interesting." Sarah handed Mom a small bag containing Max's food, some treats, and a folder with information about his hospital routine. But Max wasn't interested in any of that. His focus was entirely on me and Mom, as if he was cataloging all the details of our faces and scents and voices to make sure we were really who he remembered. "There's one other thing," Sarah said, her voice growing more serious. "Max has changed since he's been with us. Not in bad ways. He's still the gentle, loving dog you raised. But he's more confident now, more independent. He has a job that he takes seriously, and he's bonded with patients who need him. This visit is wonderful for all of you, but it's important to remember that his primary home is at the hospital now." I nodded, understanding what she was really telling us. This wasn't a trial run for Max coming home permanently. This was a chance to reconnect, to show him that we still loved him, to satisfy his need for family contact while respecting the new life he'd built. As Sarah drove away, promising to see us Sunday evening, I sat on the front steps of our apartment building with Max pressed against my side, hardly believing this was real. Mom sat on the other side of him, her hand resting on his back, all of us just breathing in the miracle of being together again. "Are you hungry, buddy?" I asked, and Max's ears perked up at the familiar question. Some things apparently never changed. That weekend was a gift I hadn't known I needed. Max settled back into our apartment routines as if he'd never left, but there were differences that spoke to his growth and new confidence. He didn't follow us from room to room the way he used to. He was content to stay in the living room when we went to the kitchen, secure in the knowledge that we weren't disappearing. He slept on his old bed instead of on my bed, though he did come up for morning cuddles when I woke up. But the most remarkable change was in the way he seemed to assess our emotional states. Max had always been intuitive about feelings, but now he was almost professional about it. When Mom got a difficult phone call from work on Saturday afternoon, Max immediately went to her and rested his head on her lap, not seeking comfort for himself, but offering it to her with the practiced skill of someone whose job it was to recognize and respond to human distress. On Saturday evening, we took Max for a long walk through our old neighborhood. He greeted familiar sights and smells with interest but not desperation, like someone visiting a place they'd once lived, rather than someone coming home. At Washington Park, he played gently with a few other dogs but kept checking back with us, making sure we were still there, still part of his experience. "He's grown up," Mom observed as we sat on our old bench while Max investigated the pond where ducks were floating in the evening light. And he had. The Max who had left us 3 months ago had been completely dependent on us for everything: food, shelter, companionship, purpose. The Max who had come back was still loving, still connected to us, but he had his own life now, his own sense of mission and importance. Sunday morning, I woke up to find Max sitting by my bed, alert and ready for the day. But instead of the demanding energy he used to have about morning walks, there was patience in his posture, a professional readiness that reminded me he had work to do, places to be, people who depended on him. We spent the morning doing all of Max's favorite things from the old days: a long walk, some time at the park, a visit to Peterson's Corner Market where Mr. Peterson made a huge fuss over him and gave him one of the expensive treats. But there was a quality of ritual to it all, like we were honoring the past rather than trying to reclaim it. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw a photo that made my heart swell with pride and bittersweetness. It was Lucy, the little girl who had been Max's first patient. She was clearly at home now. The photo showed her in what looked like a backyard, her hair growing back in soft brown curls, her cheeks fuller and pinker than they'd been in the hospital photos. She was holding a small golden retriever puppy, and the resemblance to Max was unmistakable. The text message read, "Hi Marcus. This is Lucy's mom. Sarah gave me your number. Lucy wanted you to see our new puppy. We named him Max Jr. because your Max taught Lucy how to be brave, and she wanted a dog who could help her stay brave at home. Thank you for sharing him with us when we needed him most." I showed the photo to Mom, and we both looked over at Max, who was lying in a patch of sunlight streaming through our living room window, completely content and at peace. "Look what you started, buddy," I said softly, and Max's tail gave a gentle wag. That afternoon, we did something we'd never done before. We talked to Max about his life at the hospital. I told him about Lucy's letter, about the photos Sarah had sent of him working with other children, about how proud we were of the important work he was doing. Mom told him about Grandma's death, about how being in Phoenix had helped her understand that love sometimes meant accepting endings so that new beginnings could happen. Max listened with the same focused attention he'd always given to our conversations, but there was something different in his expression, a kind of adult understanding that hadn't been there before. He knew he was loved, knew he had been missed, but he also seemed to understand that his life had expanded beyond just our small family unit. When Sarah arrived Sunday evening to pick him up, Max went to her willingly, his tail wagging with what looked like anticipation to return to his important work. He said goodbye to us with the same joy he'd shown in greeting, lots of tail wagging and face licking and pressing against us, but there was no anxiety in his departure, no sense that he was being abandoned again. As I watched Sarah's car pull away with Max sitting calmly in the back seat, looking out the window at us with alert, happy eyes, I realized that this was what successful love looked like. We had raised Max to be confident, gentle, and caring. When circumstances forced us apart, he had taken those qualities and used them to build a meaningful life that served others. And now, secure in his new purpose, he was able to maintain his connection to us without being diminished by the separation. "He's going to be okay," Mom said, standing beside me on the sidewalk as the car disappeared around the corner. "We're all going to be okay," I replied, and for the first time since this whole journey began, I really believed it. 3 weeks later, I got an email from David's parents, the 9-year-old boy who had been Max's new patient assignment. The surgery had gone perfectly, and David had been calm and brave throughout the entire process because Max had been with him every step of the way. The email included a drawing David had made of himself and Max, with the words, "My hero dog," written in careful crayon letters across the top. I printed the drawing and put it on my bedroom wall, next to the photo of Lucy with her new puppy. These were Max's children now, his family, his purpose, and I was proud to have been part of preparing him for this important work. Every month Max comes for his weekend visit, and every month I see him growing more into himself, more confident, more purposeful, more at peace with his place in the world. He still loves me, still remembers every game we used to play and every routine we used to share. But he's also become something bigger than just my beloved pet. He's become a healer, a comfort giver, a bridge between fear and courage for children facing the hardest challenges of their young lives. And every time I see him trot confidently back to Sarah's car on Sunday evening, ready to return to his important work, I'm reminded that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone we love is the freedom to become who they were always meant to be. The boy who whispered, "Don't let him be alone" at the hospital that day had been afraid that leaving Max there meant abandoning him. What I understand now is that I wasn't abandoning Max. I was setting him free to find his true calling. And in doing so, I learned that love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go, and trusting that the love you've given someone will guide them toward their highest purpose. Max isn't alone. He never was, and he never will be. He's surrounded by love, from his patients, his co-workers, his monthly family visits, and the hundreds of children whose lives he's touched with his gentle presence and intuitive wisdom. And neither am I alone. The love Max and I shared for 8 years didn't disappear when we were separated. It multiplied, expanded, became something that touches more lives than I ever imagined possible. Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't about staying together forever. Sometimes they're about loving someone so completely that you can trust them to carry that love into the world and use it to heal others. This is the story of Max, the golden retriever who taught me that true love means wanting someone to become their best self, even when that means loving them from a distance. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that love finds a way to circle back to you, transformed and multiplied, carrying with it the wisdom that comes from a life lived in service to others. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Max was never silent in his love, never absent in his loyalty, and never alone in his purpose. For every child whose fear he transformed into courage, for every family whose heartbreak he helped heal, his golden presence continues to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that neither Marcus nor Max could have imagined when they first said goodbye. Love, it turns out, is the only thing that grows when you give it away.